Welcome back, friends. Let's have another important session in which we are going to start with a very interesting pattern, that is keyword clusters and thematic mapping. We will try to understand how patterns of the word reveal narrative that is hidden. I welcome you in this session in which let's firstly try to understand when single words are not enough, then what should we focus? Sometimes a single word might be confusing, then what is to be done? There comes the keyword clusters. In our earlier sessions, we had a look on keyword analysis and various other shades in which we understood how words and their company matter. But here in this session, we are going to start an interesting perspective, that is keyword clusters. A single keyword may reveal something important, but a cluster of related keywords reveal a broader narrative. So, when your requirement is to find out a broader motive or intention of the speaker or the author, then you cannot just merely focus on a particular word, but you have to consider the keyword cluster. It uncovers the emotional patterns, behavioral intent, thematic fixation, and often concealed psychological states. This is where forensic linguistics become storytelling with evidence, because you are taking into consideration a broader aspect. Then let's find out what are the keyword clusters as such. Keyword clusters are the groups of keywords that repeatedly appear together across texts or within single document. These clusters often share emotional tone, for example, angry, hurt, insult, or upset. So, this shows a consistent emotional mood running through the text. That is category number one. Secondly, semantic fields, for example, keyword cluster like money, bank, transfer, account, etc. All these words belong to the same topic, that is finance. Third, psychological motive, keyword cluster like deserved, fault, blame, mistake. Here you will find a justification mindset, that is shifting the responsibility. Or fourthly, operational themes, in which you will find the keyword cluster like meet, call, plan, or finish. Here the sequence of action that speaks and not the emotion. And therefore, instead of studying the words in isolation, we observe how they form meaning network. It's like a constellation of words, keywords. And therefore, keyword clusters act like a nervous system of a text. They show how thoughts and feelings are traveling. Then the question comes, why keyword clusters matter in forensic investigation and how it would be useful. For that, we have to understand that keyword clusters help the investigators to identify themes of coercion, patterns of planning, emotional instability of the speaker, ideological obsession or a motive to achieve, and lastly, the relationship dynamics. Sometimes the complex relationship persists. Let's take an example. In a threatening sender note, where the cluster might appear as such time, final, warning, tonight, urgently. Now, this demonstrates the notion of urgency and escalation. Or let's take the example of suicidal note, in which sorry, love, burden, forgive, ain't, dead end, these kind of words are there. So these keyword clusters suggests us the relational focus. These clusters reveal the inner storyline, that what a person must have went through before committing this action. Now let's understand cluster mapping using tools like Lanxbox or Sketch Engine. Friends, the software can visualize keyword clusters as maps where nodes represent words and links that represent collocational strength. Let's analyze this with three phases. Phase number 1, central emotional anchors. Stage 2, secondary supporting themes. And thirdly, peripheral but recurring ideas. Now let's understand how these three can be interlinked and what keyword cluster we can find. First, central emotional anchors. Let's take the example of the word unfair. Now this is a feeling, something is unfair with someone. This is a central notion around which the entire text is revolving. Now the word unfair appears more frequently and connects to many other things, and therefore it carries the core emotional charge in the text. Now it's a skill to identify this central emotional anchor. We have identified it as a unfair. Fine. Secondly, now we have to find out secondary supporting themes. Here we may come across the terms like targeted, treated, ignored, blamed. Now these words suggest what is unfair. This explains why this emotion exists, why unfairness is observed by the person. Because either he is ignored, he is blamed, he is targeted, or he is treated in a particular way. And therefore, the central emotion unfairness has been now attached with some more secondary supporting themes. Then thirdly, you may come across peripheral but non-conclusive recurring ideas. For example, you may come across scattered terms like email, meeting, manager. Now ordinarily, these three words directly does not suggest unfairness, but they may form a causal nexus with what must have been unfair with this person, what could be the reason. It could be email, it could be meeting, it could be a manager or some other hints, but they are peripheral, they are non-conclusive. And therefore, if they appear repeatedly, all these three considerations form a cluster. And therefore, cluster mapping is powerful because it transforms the complex text into cognitive landscapes and allowing the investigator to find out the truth. Friends, now let's take an example of keyword cluster in domestic violence case. For example, in an anonymized domestic violence case, the cluster analysis shows recurring themes around possession. Now the words may come like mine, belong, or control, etc. Or there might be nuances or notions for punishment, for example, teach, hurt, a lesson. Or there might be another cluster about surveillance, that watching, tracking, following, pursuing, etc. Now individually these keywords seems harmless, but if you form them together, if you see the wider perspective, they created a chilling narrative of coercive control. And therefore, the cluster map helps the court in understanding psychological environment around the victim. Let's change the example and find out cluster patterns in corporate fraud emails. Now here investigators discovered that fraudulent emails consistently included clusters around persuasion and urgency. The words like quick, benefit, trust, deal, confidential, urgent, window, deadline, etc. Now these word clusters or keyword clusters repeated across multiple emails reveal the sender's persuasive strategy and operational planning. This evidence helps to dismantle the narrative that the fraud was spontaneous or accidental. Now let's have a look on emotional signature, how keyword cluster can identify the psychological state of the person. For example, a corpus of words often reveal emotional signatures. For example, the first emotion is anger. So the cluster might give you the words like destroy, hate, ruin, or pay. Second cluster of fear, the emotion of fear might have clusters like help, escape, afraid, helpless, etc. Third emotion of, for example, guilt, the cluster may form the words like sorry, mistake, forgive, unintentional, etc. or beg the pardon. Fourth, emotion of dominance. The clusters may give you words like command, obey, order, or authority. So, emotional clusters are central to the psycholinguistic profiling and risk assessment. This may act like a predictive. Measures can be taken because of the words are suggesting so. Now, let's have a look on operational clusters in threat or terrorist cases or in organized crime where multiple operations are taken place. In extremism or organized crime cases, keyword clusters often include operational markers. For example, for movement, you will find route, path, shift, arrange, etc. For timing, you may come across the phrases like before the dawn, after the sunset, immediately after that, etc. Or for resource terms, material, package, device, etc. Or coded logistics, for example, is it ready, final step, signal, warning, etc. So these clusters reveal planning depth and sometimes help decrypt coded communication. Now let's have a look on cluster dispersion, understanding when the themes appear. Some clusters appear early in the document as a framing devices and others appear at the end as an escalation markers. For example, in ransom letters, in the beginning, it often contains the justification clusters, for example, forced, no choice, I'm handcuffed, etc. In the middle, it contains the instruction clusters, for example, follow, bring, do not police, do not delay, etc. And at the end, it would contain the threat cluster, for example, last chance, end badly, you will have to face, etc. Now, this dispersion helps reconstruction of narrative flow and emotional trajectory. Let's have a look on cluster comparison across suspects or text groups. Friends, when comparing text from multiple suspects, cluster analysis reveals who shares thematic habits. If two suspects show the identical cluster themes around dominance or grievance, it strengthens the linkage. If one suspect cluster map is radically different, it supports elimination. So the cluster comparison is extremely useful in authorship disputes. Friends, now we will try to have a look on cultural and multilingual influences on keyword clusters. This is very interesting part and you will definitely find some very familiar examples into this. Let's consider about Indian situation. In India's multilingual landscape, clusters often include culturally anchored combinations. Let's identify 4 clusters. First is Hinglish, that is Hindi plus English. Full tension, adjust kar lo, etc. Secondly, Tamil plus English. Romba solid, tension illa. Thirdly, Punjabi plus English. Gal serious ah. Fourth, Marathi plus English cluster. For example, matter serious ahe, etc. So this reveals regional identity and socio-linguistic background. These clusters help narrow down suspect pools and interpret context the most accurate way. Friends, at the end, we again talk about ethical approaches to cluster interpretation. It is inevitable part. We have to observe utmost possible ethical approaches. So here, cluster analysis must be used carefully. Clusters reflect tendencies and not the guilt. and therefore they provide psychological and narrative insight, not definitive proof. Ethical practice means contextualizing cluster patterns within broader evidence, avoiding stereotyping and clearly stating analytical limits. So, in simple words, we should not forget what is our objective while doing cluster analysis. Therefore, we can safely say that clusters turn linguistic chaos into coherent stories. Thank you so much, friends, for engaging into this session. Here we have understood keyword clusters, how they reveal the architecture behind the person's language, the emotional scaffolding, and operational logic. This allows investigator to step inside the mind of the writer or speaker through patterns. In the very next video, we will try to understand how dispersion analysis can be done, and we will explore how language shifts across time and context. Thank you.